Good afternoon, Rotarians. Today we're going to begin our next downtown Rotary meeting. I'm Jessie Schmidt. I'm our downtown president, and I would like to start with the Rotary four-way test. And Rotarians across the world use this test as we evaluate what we're going to speak about and what sort of activities we're going to engage in. And we start with, is it the truth? Number two is it fair to all concerned? Number three, will it build goodwill and better relationships? And lastly, will it be beneficial to all concerned? So this is something that Rotary has been doing for many, many years. And it's always at the forefront of what we do as part of our downtown club. Today, we have a great meeting to bring to you. We're going to have Tom Meyer is going to do a mentoring minute for us. And then we're going to have a meeting hosted by Jason Herpelt from First Bank and Trust. And we're going to have Dr. Joe Santos, talk to us really about the state of the economy and the monetary policy. So first, we're going to kick it off with Tom.
Thanks, President Jessie, and good afternoon, fellow Rotarians. My name is Tom Meyer, and I have been involved in the Lutheran Social Services Mentoring Program for 6 years. My wife, Marilyn, and I got involved in mentoring when our daughter, Colleen, was teaching at George McGovern Middle School and asked us to be mentors. I began meeting with Owen at Edison Middle School, and Marilyn mentored Emma Lynn at Whittier. Owen and I met once a week for 45 minutes during the school year and hung out, visited, and played games like Yahtzee, chess, and Battleship. I mentored Owen until high school, and we still keep in touch today. I am now mentoring Thomas at John Harris Elementary, and we meet over his lunch period and hang out. A few things that make mentoring so easy. Almost every school needs mentors, and I am pretty sure there is one close to where you live or work. The relationship is fun, and for someone my age, feels like a grandparent relationship. For example, I encourage Thomas to eat all of his lunch and do his schoolwork, but I don't nag him. Mentees want mentors, so they enjoy your company. The teachers are very accommodating and appreciative. If I need to miss a week, I let the school and Thomas know ahead of time. Mentoring is on your schedule and requires 45 minutes a week. Again, the proximity of where you mentor can be within 5 minutes of where you live or work. Most of the schools near downtown Sioux Falls need mentors. I have done a lot of volunteering in my life and find mentoring really provides a unique, tangible, positive feeling for me and the mentees. Bob Timian expressed these very sentiments at the Mentoring Initiative in January. Mentoring is a great way to live out service above self, which is most applicable during the Easter season. Mentoring not only brings joy, but students statistically do better. You can explore many kinds of mentoring by going to sioux52.org. LSS Everyday Heroes is the mentoring that brings joy to my life, and there are a number of ways that you can mentor. I want to close with an excerpt from a letter I received a year ago from Owen, which was approximately a year after we finished our mentoring. In this letter, he's referring to a letter that I had sent him previously. I found your letter, and it made me fill with joy because you were and still are a big part of my life. Every Thursday, I would be waiting until OS so we can go outside or play chess. I don't think I thanked you enough for how big of a part you are in my life and how you affected me, because whenever I saw you, you were always positive and happy. And if I was sad that day, you would cheer me up, and I thank you for that. Mentoring is a very important, impactful, and rewarding thing that we all can do. I invite you to join me in mentoring in Sioux Falls. Thank you.
Tom, thanks so much, and really appreciate the time that you've invested in Thomas and Owen. And that's exactly what we are looking to do, just to change one person's life, one person at a time. And it's a true testament to your commitment. So thanks so much for sharing your experience with us today. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Jesse.
So we're going to talk to Dr. Joe Santos today. Joe teaches macroeconomics and monetary and financial economics, with the primary part of Joe's research is central banking, and specifically how monetary policies shape patterns of inflation and output growth. We look forward to hearing from you today, Dr. Santos, and Jason's going to take the conversation away. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Fellow Rotarians, it is a great privilege of mine to sit here today and enjoy a conversation with my friend Joe Santos. Joe, thank you. You're a very busy individual, and I can't imagine right now, with all that is going on economically and in this country, that you are not pressed for time. So you spending some time with myself and the Rotarians across the state is very much appreciated. Thank you. Joe, you teach macroeconomics and monetary and financial economics. Much of your work has involved the study of monetary policy and what it means for growth, for inflation. Tell us, tell the audience, how significant is this moment? And what are things that you are looking for from policymakers as they deal with the economic consequences of this pandemic?
Well, first of all, Jason, thank you for having me. This is a real honor. I really appreciate this invitation to share my thoughts on these issues. Well, that's a really big question to start with. Let me start with the bad. Right now, it's quite evident that macroeconomic activity is going to contract significantly in the second quarter at the very least. And let me quantify contract significantly. Most reasonable estimates are that we're looking at something on an annual basis in the neighborhood of 20%. That's on an annual basis. We know this in part because of what we're seeing in the labor market. The deterioration in the labor market is fast and it's furious. So just to get some sense, we can judge from initial claims for unemployment. I'm sure our reviewers have come across these numbers, and some of them can really cause our eyes to gloss over. But the number to think about right now, the number we know, is about 25 million individuals have claimed for unemployment insurance. Those are initial claims. We also have continued claims for unemployment, individuals who would have left the unemployment status, if you will, had the economy been able to accommodate them in the labor force. So, you can do a very quick back of the envelope calculation, right? We know the labor force is about 160 million, and now we know 25 million people have claimed since the last time the Bureau of Labor Statistics has interviewed anyone and asked, are you actively seeking for work? So very quick calculation suggests that we're looking at something on the order of 15 to 20% unemployment. That's based on the last few weeks of claims. So this is an enormous and rapid deterioration of the labor market. And this is particularly problematic because the way unemployment patterns play out in general. Now, I don't know, there's a lot, I'm sure we're going to talk about just how unique this particular shock is, in part because it's an epidemiological shock, not an economic shock in the traditional sense. But unemployment typically rises quickly, and then it comes back down much more slowly. And this isn't just a pattern at the national level that we see when we take some sort of average of labor force deterioration. You can see this in the state of South Dakota, for example. If you look at unemployment claims, I mentioned the initial claims, the continued claims, they've all spiked, much as I refer to the spike in the national claims. The unemployment rate is slated to be higher, not on the order of the national level, but all of this is playing out here as well. And if you look at the most recent financial crisis, you will see again that at the state level, unemployment patterns were very similar. The number spiked, albeit not as high as the national level, and then it came down very gradually. If anyone's keeping track, I think it was about maybe 2015 or 2016 that the unemployment rate in South Dakota came back down to what it was before the financial crisis. So deterioration in the labor market is a very serious problem, and it relates very closely to deterioration in macroeconomic activity more generally. And again, here we could just look at the arithmetic. Roughly 70% of gross domestic product is income paid to wage earners. So if you have this deterioration in the labor market, it's a fair bet that you're also going to see deterioration in the real economy. And all of this is made worse by the fact that we don't know, and again, I'm guessing we'll talk a bit about this, whether this is a one-time V-shaped contraction or if this is a longer-lived contraction. And the difference is enormous. If it's V-shaped, all of the economic loss is sort of regained, if you will, in some sense, rather quickly, and we're back to normal rather quickly. If it's U-shaped, that loss persists quarter after quarter after quarter. So it's sort of like taking the volume of that U-shaped bucket that we all visualize in our head when we think about the U-shape, taking the volume of, let's say, water that bucket holds, that's all of the economic loss. So it's just not a matter of how much economic activity contracts. It's also for how long economic activity remains in that contracted state. And so the contraction itself is bad. The deterioration in the labor market is bad. It will be worse if this process is long-lived, if we're talking about a U, let's say, as opposed to a V. So there's no sugarcoating all of that. But there's a plus side. The US economy had been in roughly a decade-long expansion before this occurred. The labor markets nationally and at the state level were anything but deteriorated. They were incredibly strong, incredibly robust. I don't mean this in a sort of callous way, but if this shock were to hit any economy, best that it hit this economy when it was running, if you will, on all cylinders. So the economy is strong. Perhaps more importantly, this is a shock at the moment, largely to aggregate demand. We're sheltering in place. We can't shop. We can't engage in economic activity the way we might have otherwise. All of the ingredients for economic activity are still in place. We haven't lost our labor force. We haven't lost our equipment, our machinery. We don't have a financial crisis at the moment. We haven't lost a way to channel loanable funds through the financial system. And we haven't lost the recipes. We still know how to build a 767, right? It's not like we have forgotten any of this. And then perhaps most importantly, and I think a Rotary Club, an organization like this, speaks to this last point, we still have our institutions. We still have our democracy. We still have our rule of law. All of these components remain in place. What we have is a temporary demand shock at the moment. I understand it can bleed into some supply consequences as well, but it's a temporary shock. And it's the type of shock that actually macroeconomic policy is best suited to address. I would argue. We can build on that if you wish.
Yeah. There's a lot to that. And there's a lot that goes into what you're describing, Joe. You know, we have in the audience today, we have a lot of small business owners. We have farmers. They're in Brookings. They're on Main Street, Sioux Falls. They're in communities across the state. They turn on the news. They're listening to this. They're listening to you. They're listening to economists all the time. Nevertheless, their revenue isn't increasing. Their savings is depleting. And their customers just aren't showing up anymore. Those things are not changing yet. Why do the measures taken by the Federal Reserve and Congress matter? And why should they remain hopeful as they plan their future?
Well, as I was starting to say, what we're seeing is a macroeconomic shock that in some ways is well suited to macroeconomic policy. When we think of macroeconomic policy, at least in the context of the situation we're dealing with right now, we think of stabilization. So in other words, you have an economy that, as I said earlier, when it's running on all cylinders, when it's at its potential, produces one level of economic activity. And now you have an economy that's producing something far less. That output gap, as macroeconomists like to refer to it as, is something that macroeconomic policy actually is reasonably well suited to address. That is, a short-term deviation from potential output is something that fiscal policy and monetary policy actually can do something about. Now, cannot do something about if this is a new normal, but if it's not a new normal and potential is essentially back to where we'll end up, then there is something policy can do. And generally speaking, from 50,000 or 100,000 feet looking down, what stabilization policy is essentially going to do is attempt to smooth income, if you will, smooth economic activity. I mean, what you have going on right now is a situation, as I said, where the economy's potential is still in place, but at the moment, the economy cannot produce at a level it once did. You have two options. You can simply sit back as policymakers and watch this economy reduce its economic activity and watch individuals attempt on their own to address the calamity. Or you can use the force, the sort of the collective force and the creditworthiness of the federal government to attempt to basically borrow against the future. And in so doing, smooth economic activity. So provide income to individuals now, provide working capital to firms now. And in so doing, admittedly borrowing against the future as we do it, we can smooth that activity and not see the kinds of disruptions we might otherwise see. We don't want this to be gloom and doom, but the reality is there is a phenomenon in macroeconomics we call hysteresis, which is where the short term can become persistent and become long term. And in particular in labor markets, we see this. When we see labor market separation, as we like to euphemistically refer to it as, right, when one becomes separated from the labor market, skills deteriorate, interactions that would otherwise make an individual more employable are no longer available to the individual. And so that individual has a tougher and tougher time reattaching herself to the labor market. And so the more quickly we can alleviate the pain, and in particular alleviate the pain in the labor market, the less we have to deal with in potentially the long run, when the damages that are inflicted on the economy now could possibly reveal themselves going forward. Because again, these things have a way, if they are left unattended, to stick, to persist, if you will. So I think what folks, on Main Street need to recognize is, while monetary and fiscal policy are never panaceas for the long run. Again, if this is the new normal, forgive me, but that's not what stabilization policy seeks to deal with. But if it's not the new normal, as I suspect it's not, and the potential capacity of the economy remains in place, then things like the Paycheck Protection Program, things like the various credit facilities right now established as a joint effort between the Treasury and the Fed, we can talk more about those, will essentially underwrite revenues, essentially underwrite incomes in ways that, again, it's not a magic act, essentially borrow against our future, but in so doing, create a stability that will allow us to then exit this crisis in a way that doesn't leave scars.
Yeah, it seems like the consensus is pretty much there, that there needs to be fuel injected into this economy, no matter what side of the political or economic aisle you perhaps would be. When you watch our policymakers right now, what would be the two biggest blunders that they could make right now when they're making decisions?
Yeah, I think the first, and this sort of picks up on your question, I think the first problem might be a tendency toward what will seem to be fiscal prudence. So in other words, for lack of a better way to put it, perhaps not doing too much for fear that because we are borrowing against the future, of course, the bill will come due. And so this is fiscally imprudent to act in too aggressive a way, right? And I That's a concern of mine. And this isn't coming from someone who, espouses modern monetary theory or something. We could talk more about that. We'll get there. But again, if you think about this as a short-term, significant contraction from potential output that needs to be alleviated or addressed as quickly as possible, otherwise the costs of not doing so can scar the economy for many, many years to come, then a quick cost-benefit analysis demonstrates that the additional debt, frankly, and we can talk more about that as well, but the additional debt, the additional borrowing against the future that we must do is warranted. And I am concerned that perhaps that dynamic thinking, that is looking at this intertemporally across time, may not be what dominates in some cases, and instead what may dominate is a sort of temptation to want to, understandably, balance the books as quickly as we possibly can and reduce debt burdens as quickly as we possibly can. But again, doing that could leave long-term scars on the economy, because it necessarily will mean leaving the output gap in place for longer than it might otherwise need to be left in place. So that's a concern. The other one I think we'll get back to, so I'll be very brief. But we have now unleashed in the last, 4 to 5 weeks, several credit facilities through our central bank. Something on the order of $2.3 trillion of potential lending capacity. That's a use of our central bank that is largely unprecedented. And that's another concern of mine. And this is more long-term, admittedly, but the fundamental role of a central bank is to be a steward of the purchasing power of money. And what we seem to be doing right now is sort of bringing it into this process, this very kind of intimate process where the central bank is now placed in the position of lending, both on the secondary and primary markets, to firms, to businesses, to Main Street, as one of the lending facilities is actually called. And the mechanisms themselves, I think, make very good sense. Bringing the Fed into this implementation process concerns me a little bit. And again, I'll leave it to you to decide whether we should elaborate on this, because it does blur the lines, if you will, the line between an independent, highly credible central bank in charge primarily of being a steward of the money supply and its purchasing power, keeping inflation low and stable, and doing everything else. Right. So that's another concern of mine, is that sort of slippery slope.
We're gonna come back to that in a second, because that touches on some things that I think the people listening today, we're in South Dakota, and being conservative with our money is something that's in our DNA. So I really do want to spend some time on that. But in terms of preparation for the situation that we are in here, it seems as though the Great Recession that happened over a decade ago almost seems like a dress rehearsal to what we're experiencing now. Hopefully that's not the case. But in your view, were there some lessons by policymakers during the Great Recession that are helping to prepare them for this crisis?
Yeah, I think so. And there are, I would think of it this way. I think monetary policy makers learned something about monetary policy, and in the process, we all learned something about monetary policy. And then let me switch over to fiscal in a moment. Monetary policy, I think, learned what Mario Draghi, who was then the governor of the European Central Bank, referred to as whatever it takes. That this was not the time for the central bank to shy away from being the lender or market maker of last resort at the risk of reliving a Great Depression. And so I think what monetary policy makers recognized, and again, I suspect we'll bring this up again in a moment, but that there is a sort of a carve out in the Federal Reserve Act, this so-called Section 13.3, that now seems to be something everyone's talking about, which is quite funny to me. But Section 13.3, it's very esoteric, but essentially says that in, quote, unusual and exigent circumstances, which I think the current situation qualifies for, the Fed can engage very aggressively in easing of various sorts in the credit markets. And I think the Fed learned that lesson, that whatever it takes may be the orientation that is most appropriate in the midst of a severe economic contraction such as this. And I'll just add, but we may have learned that lesson too well. And again, I'll come back to this, but I see the current sort of orientation or mindset as central bank as go-to for stabilization policy, perhaps as an artifact of that lesson learned, and perhaps lesson learned too well. The other is fiscal policy. And I should say for folks, the audience, I'm sure has a sort of a varied sense of all this stuff and experience with it. When we're referring to fiscal policy, we're referring to the arcane term fisc. So this is the purse, if you will, of the treasury or the sovereign. And so this is raising taxes, spending, and if you spend more than you raise in taxes, you borrow. So in some sense, this is very much checkbook treasury economics. Fiscal policymakers, I think, learned as well that fiscal policy is not as useless as we might have thought it was. Again, just to flash back, before 2008, we got into a very comfortable macroeconomic groove, starting from the late 60s, which was monetary policy is the go-to stabilization policy. Fiscal policy, not so much. There are arguments, the thinking went for reducing taxes for the sake of efficiency, for raising taxes for the sake of fiscal management. But the idea of stimulating the economy back to its potential using fiscal policy had fallen out of favor. And monetary policy, as I say, became, as I like to say, the sharpest tool in the shed. So what we learned, I think monetary policy makers realized the tool was quite sharp and that there were opportunities to use it quite aggressively, if perhaps now to a fault. But fiscal policymakers also learned that fiscal policy may have a place in the economy, though there I would add the caveat, I'm not sure the lesson was learned well enough. So two lessons learned, one very well in the case of monetary policy with respect to its powers of stabilization or the sense of its powers of stabilization. The other, the powers of fiscal policy, but perhaps we're still not entirely convinced on that second.
Yeah. You alluded to this a little earlier about some concerns you have with the Fed putting together all these different credit facilities through Section 13.3. We were in this thing now 6 weeks, and governments and central banks across the world have been implementing an economic version of shock and awe. What if the economic disruption extends a year or longer? Are there any limits, to their ability to soften that blow? And then, as important, what could those unintended consequences be of the market getting too comfortable with the Federal Reserve serving as that backstop or putting a put on economic activity?
Right. Yeah. This is so if the problem extends. So I don't mean to be too sort of in the weeds here, but let's go back to this sort of device of potential output versus where we are now. If the gap extends for another year or two, it is still fundamentally then a gap, right? And we still have the ingredients, we still have the recipes, we still haven't forgotten how to produce a 767, though I don't suspect we're ever going to forget that in the near term, but you know what I mean.
Right.
If it remains a gap, then I think stabilization policy still may have a role to play, albeit at that point, they will be in that role for quite some time. And so they will be stressing, if you will, some of the tools or the instruments that they have at their disposal, for sure. Now, the second part. So what about that sort of that stress or that tension on the tools? Well, again, back to the policy mix. If it's fiscal policy that we are pushing, say, to its limits, what does that look like? We are continuing to provide paycheck protection. We are continuing to, in effect, underwrite working capital. We are doing all of this necessarily by borrowing, because of course raising taxes to pay for this all would be entirely counterproductive. So the tension or the stress point there would be the debt, right? The deficit is a flow. It's the new amount by which you're in the red in say a particular year. The debt is the accumulation of all those deficits. And that debt, of course, has been growing and will continue to grow. And so that's a potential stress point. I don't think that that stress point, though, will be acute enough to force the federal government at any time in the sort of near future, let's say, vaccine time. I think the federal government will have ample firepower if it deems it appropriate to continue drawing on the fisc's resources. Why? Well, essentially what the federal government is doing right now, again, 50, 60, 70,000 feet looking down, they are selling bonds to individuals who are precautionarily saving, right? Fill in the blank. Blank is king. Cash is king, right? That's what everyone is saying right now. So there's this tendency to hoard precautionarily. From 50,000 feet, the federal government is simply soaking up that savings and reallocating it to the economy. And because it is precautionary, because there is a preference on the part of financial markets to save in that way, the financial markets are surrendering those savings at relatively low rates. Just look at what treasury rates are, right? You can borrow 1 or 2 or 5 or 10, you, the treasury, none of us. That's an important difference, but they can. And so they're essentially drawing on what is a large amount of precautionary savings and redeploying it into the economy. They can do that for quite some time more, even though the debt to GDP ratio continues to rise. And I will just say, and let's put a pin in this, but if folks are concerned that debt to GDP could skyrocket as a result of this, I would only offer the following thought experiment. To do nothing will arithmetically still cause debt to GDP to rise, this time because GDP will collapse. So in some arithmetic sense, you can preserve or you can stabilize debt to GDP if GDP grows. And so the GDP growth is your friend in that relationship of debt to GDP. And so taking on more debt grows the numerator unquestionably, but doing nothing may weaken the denominator, and that too would create a debt to GDP explosion. So we need to consider that. So I think there's room there. On the monetary policy, it gets back to this idea of the monetary liabilities of the US economy. Essentially currency in circulation, what economists refer to, by the way, as outside money. The central bank injects it from the outside. We have currency in circulation, think 1s and 5s and 10s and 20s that we have on our person. And then essentially think of that cash in the form of bank vault inventory. And then you have reserves. And that's what we call the monetary base. And what you're referring to is the fact that before the financial crisis, the monetary base was about $800 billion. Maybe a better way to think about it is it was about 6% of GDP. It's about 6. During the heat of the financial crisis, it got up to somewhere just, I believe, south of 20%. And now it's headed back up from 15 or 16 and will, I suspect, very soon be at 25 or 30 easily as a percent of GDP. So that's a lot of raw material in the form of bank reserves. By the way, it's all bank reserves. Currency is not growing. It's the bank reserves that are growing in these aggressive ways. There's really no budgetary constraint on the Federal Reserve in this regard, right? So the good news is we have a fiat money. It is money by decree. The Fed can produce it at zero marginal cost as much as it wants. And that's both the blessing and the curse of this. And so while there is no constraint on how large the monetary base can get, we measure it in relation to GDP, but the relationship means nothing to the Fed's ability to produce the monetary base. But of course, as I know everyone in the audience has already gotten to, they're thinking, yes, but the money supply, what we buy lunch with, and the monetary base, the raw materials that the Fed produces, are very closely aligned in the long run. And in fact, if you look at the data right now, you don't have to look at the long run. The last 5 weeks, M1, M2 measures of money have grown rather large at large rates, 10, 15%, not unprecedented, but large. And of course, then if we have more money and we don't have as many goods, we have inflation. So roundabout way of saying, for monetary policy, this is tricky. There is no explicit budget constraint. There's no market mechanism that says, Fed, you're growing the monetary base too high, other than the inflation rate, which will begin to rise if the purchasing power of money falls because there's too much money and not a lot of goods. At the moment, there's no reason to be concerned about this. The actual inflation rate, and indeed inflation expectations, are well below the Fed's 2% target. But I would just say the actual inflation rate is just that. It's what happens now. It's not a reflection of the future. And the expected inflation rate, while ostensibly it's a reflection of the future, it's based on the expectations of market participants who may not be thinking about the sort of deep questions you and I are provoking right now. And so it may not reflect any inflation until it's too late. So while inflation is not a fear in the near term, that's the constraint. When you asked, is there sort of a too far that the Fed can go? Well, it would come in the form of a loss in the purchasing power of money, an unacceptable loss. A targeted loss is about a 2% inflation rate, but I'm referring now to an unacceptable loss.
Over the last 10 to 12 years, the money supply has increased because of all these steps that the Federal Reserve has taken. I think in March, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet was just under 4 trillion. There's talks of it reaching 10 trillion before this is all over with. Those are huge numbers. The Treasury, the US government will have a debt of about 24 trillion. I think that's about right now. Should we even care? I realize in the short term, we all get it. If we don't do anything, it's going to get worse. But in the long term, should people be concerned with those numbers? And that leads to the question of, modern monetary theory, which is essentially, it doesn't matter how much debt you have. It's going to all be okay as long as you're a reserve currency. Should we care?
Yes, I think we should. But we don't care about both. They both keep me up, but never both at the same time. Because if you think back again to this very basic arithmetic of debt to GDP, there are basically two forces imposed on that ratio. And just to level the base here, everyone realizes stabilizing debt to GDP is the right answer, right? Or perhaps reducing the debt to GDP ratio. That's what we want to do. So let's start with that premise, which is a violation of modern monetary theory. But I'll just start with that premise that we actually want to stabilize the debt to GDP ratio, or better yet, reduce it. Two forces imposing themselves on that ratio. The numerator, the debt itself, rises over time as interest rates rise. So interest rates rising, that's a bad thing because debt servicing, it rises, the cost of debt servicing. And so debt servicing plays a role in the current deficit, which then gets added to the debt, and boom, you've got the numerator growing over time. There's also growth in the denominator. And right now, that is GDP growth. Right now, what we're seeing is that, if you will, R is less than G. The interest rate that will essentially drive the cost of financing the government's debt is a smaller number than the growth rate of the economy. I'm looking past the next quarter. But all indications are that we are going to remain in a very low interest rate environment for a long time. So the debt to GDP ratio needn't explode in the way it would otherwise if R were greater than G, if we had to service the existing debt at a rate that exceeded the growth in GDP. And that's not a situation we're likely to see for the near term. And by near term, I mean several years. I suspect interest rates, once domestic product sort of gets back, recovers, I suspect that GDP growth will exceed the interest rates. And by interest rates, by the way, the only ones that matter are the ones that the Treasury pays. What you and I pay for a loan is irrelevant. The Treasury is paying at very low rates. And it's those rates that I'm referring to when I say they will likely stay relatively low for the near term. So the debt to GDP ratio needn't explode. But of course, while you sleep well at night now, after I had said that, you think, but wait a minute, the reason why interest rates are so low is precisely because the Fed is so integrated into the economy now, and the monetary base is soon to be 1/3 the size of gross domestic product, right? So this is what I mean when I say you sort of don't worry about them simultaneously. If the Fed is being this accommodative, that will likely help to, this is all else equal talk, but it will help to stabilize debt to GDP. If you'd rather sleep well knowing the monetary base is not growing the way it's growing, great. You'll sleep comfortably knowing the Fed is not intervening and not keeping interest rates low. But of course, then that will mean the debt dynamics will be more aggressive and your debt to GDP ratio will rise. So we're in a very tricky situation where ideally we'd like to see a nice small monetary base where the monetary policy is entirely conventional and this never makes it to a Rotary speaking event. And likewise, the debt to GDP ratio is comfortably below 50 or 60%. Neither one of them is true. So what is going to be required going forward is a balancing act. You want to keep the growth in the economy, again, exceeding the immediate contraction, which will be eye-popping, but you want to keep the growth in the economy higher than the cost of financing the debt in order to stabilize the ratio. That means keeping the Federal Reserve deeply accommodative. So it's balancing that.
Thank you for that explanation, because that's something that we're all trying to wrestle with, because these are just huge numbers, and you solve one problem, usually another problem is created. I'm going to pivot here and move into some subjects that are being talked about heavily, and this ties a little bit to monetary policy, but not much. The supply chain and just what's happening. It is very easy during a crisis for countries and societies to begin to look inward. When you look at history, you see that pattern quite regularly. And it's understandable why governments and people would have those kinds of instincts. Why is that a bad idea?
Yeah, so I accept the premise of your question. It's a bad idea. And if you think about what it is we're trying to do, so let's just for a moment think that this sort of supply chain disrupting event will never again occur. Just humor me for a moment. So it's never going to occur again. So now what we want to do, of course, is recognize that specialization and exchange, exploiting, if you will, what we are most productive at doing, what economists will refer to as comparative advantage, but essentially doing what it is that you do best, what presents the smallest cost to society overall, will benefit everyone. So if what you're trying to do is recover, that is, what you're trying to do is grow economic activity, then presumably what you should do is engage in the production of economic activity in a way that is most efficient and most productive, right? It's almost a tautology, right? So what does that mean? It means not relying on self-sufficiency, where you're doing lots of things, most of which, in theory, all but one of which you are not best at doing, and rather than doing what it is you're best at, and then engaging in open, free, and fair trade in order to benefit from, if you will, the comparative advantages of others. So if you're trying to recover from this economic contraction, you want to turn all the dials up in favor of economic activity, productivity, and one of those dials would be open and free trade with a very sophisticated supply chain that takes advantage of these opportunities to minimize costs of production by producing wherever it is cheapest. But I started us all off by assuming this sort of Pollyannish notion that we'll never see something like this again. The reality is we likely will. So there I would just suggest maybe thinking about this as dialing back a little bit, perhaps, from what I just said, but certainly not going all the way back in the direction of what we define as autarky, doing it all ourselves and having no trade with anyone else, right? We see the benefits of trade, of specialization, of integrated, sophisticated supply chains. The reality is perhaps some of those processes simply are not sufficiently resilient in the age of pandemics that can travel on the very 767 that we still know how to produce. So as a result, we may have to modify the processes. But again, recognize that as we turn that dial back down towards self-sufficiency, again, there's a trade-off. We lose productivity, we lose efficiencies, we lose cost minimization opportunities, And so again, we've got to strike a balance between those two and be mindful of that. Going to what economists refer to as the corner solution, go there or go there. Corner solutions never are ideal in practical applications of policy. So I would say, of course, consider the fact that the current sort of supply chain architecture is not sufficiently resilient, given what we're now experiencing and recognizing, of course. But recognizing too that there will be dramatic economic costs in the form of lost activity if we simply neglect specialization and exchange.
I don't want to get into the weeds here on this question, but I am interested to know if there's anything on the top of your mind when it comes to the agricultural industry. You know very well that we are, as a state, heavily dependent upon agriculture. That industry has been fragile for a number of years now, and now you have this disruption in supply chains interacting all over the globe. What policies would you be looking for from policymakers right now to help soften the blow for that group?
Sure. I think, I think of it as at 50,000 feet anyway, as yet another industry that needs to be, if you will, held over. That is, you need to finance payrolls. And in some cases, I know you had Senator Thune on a while back and spoke to the fact that PPP does, in some cases, address agricultural entities, but in other cases certainly does not. And so I think it's entirely appropriate there as well to use this same principle of, if you will, income smoothing and borrowing against the future in order to, if not finance economic activity, at least replenish the revenues and incomes that would have been generated had the economic activity occurred. Again, this weedsy principle of potential agricultural output and where we are right now, to the extent that you can identify that gap that is entirely responsible, or for which the virus is entirely responsible, I think it's entirely appropriate then in that case as well. It's the very same criterion I suggested earlier for stabilization policy to step in with various sorts of supports to essentially make the income statements and balance sheets whole of these agrarian concerns, much as we do all others. So this is yet another industry that I think it would be completely appropriate to support vigorously and robustly. Again, based on the same principle that there's a potential output. What would have happened had the virus not struck? I know that's a counterfactual, but nevertheless, where are we as a result? That gap should be financed, if you will, borrow against the future and finance it. Again there, because the consequences for not doing so, I know folks are listening and I hear it too when I say it, but there's the debt, but there's the debt, but there's the debt. But there will be this atrophy in the agrarian economy that may stick. It may persist. Families will be devastated. Relationships, economic as well as social, but economic relationships will deteriorate. And we probably, even if we are completely cold-hearted and calculated about this and say, well, that's fine, as long as we can mend everything and everything's back the way it was, we probably can't mend it. And then we're not cold and calculated. So we don't want to see that deterioration in the first place. So I think it's entirely appropriate. I don't think there's anything unique, except perhaps the pain itself, which is in some ways outsized relative to other industries at the moment. But there's nothing in principle unique about the industry that in some way suggests it should not receive the support that other industries do. I think it should.
That's right. You know, everything we've talked about today involves the interaction between government agencies and us as consumers or business owners, the private sector. And we all know that there's always been an entanglement between the public sector and the private sector. It's now even more entangled, and it's going to be even more so a month from now and more so 3 months from now. How do you see that ever getting untangled and or at all?
Yeah, let me just say, I think comparisons to the disentanglement after World War II are not appropriate. And the reason is that what we see here are, as you said, I agree entirely, again, with the premise of your question, this is a vast entanglement that seeks to improve outcomes for households and firms. Now, to some extent, military-industrial complex benefited firms, but not households. When we look at the increases in gross domestic product during the Second World War, for example, we do not see those increases reflected in consumption. I mean, think about folks who were rationing aluminum or whatever the case may be during the war. Households were rationing. Households were not maintaining a standard of living that they would like to maintain, and in fact did maintain after the war. So in that case, disentanglement meant going into a stage of consumption that actually was improving over the prior stage. Here you have something very different. Here what you have is government entangling in a way that provides in places salaries, income support, revenue support, working capital financing, all at very low rates, lender and creditor and buyer of last resort in the case of the central bank. And all of this is allowing individuals to continue to, and I don't mean to be, I'm using this in a technical sense, sort of satisfy their preferences. I know folks are having a horribly tough time, but the attempt is to make that time less horrible, not to build, rightly at the time, a military-industrial complex. So these interactions are directly benefiting households and firms in ways that I think may be more difficult now to disentangle, because there will be a sense of a kind of a persistence or a stickiness. I mean, think about it. Who is going to get up and say, we need to bring all of the spending back down at the cost of household welfare? We need to potentially reduce profitability. We need to increase the likelihood of financial shocks, and please vote for me, right? That's going to be a very difficult stump speech. So it will be difficult, I think, to disentangle this. Not impossible, but if we're looking for the kind of disentanglement, and even there it was not complete, disentanglement we saw, say, after the military buildup to World War II, I suspect you're going to see, for example, households, perhaps their inclination anyway may be to resist that in part because this time around it was a direct support so that the goods and services that the household procures could still be procured by the household. And healthcare is another example of this. I think there will be some lasting features of government in the economy that were not there before. So speaking just purely objective, I just as a matter of empirical fact, I think it will be difficult to unwind or, as you said, disentangle some of these relationships in ways that it may not have been in the past.
Earlier in our conversation, you had mentioned the 70% of US economic activity is driven by consumer spending. I don't know the exact number, but nearly half of all Americans have less than $2,000 in savings. There was a wealth gap before the pandemic, and that's only going to crescendo now and beyond, just due to the nature of where the layoffs are occurring. What does that mean for growth and the long-term health of our economy?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked this. Thank you. Macroeconomists spend a lot of time at very high altitudes, and we tend to average out all of the features of the economy by our nature, right? GDP per capita, for example. And we don't think about the sort of the heterogeneity, the economic diversity, or we think about it, we lose sleep over it, but our models don't always reflect it in the way perhaps they should. You can just look at this shelter in place effort that we are all engaged in. You and I are doing it, and guess what? We're also still drawing paychecks. Others are doing it, 25, 30 million folks are doing it, and they're not drawing paychecks. Right. Again, just to be very calculated for a moment, this is problematic for economic growth, in part because those folks are going to spend large percentages of their income. They are spenders, if you will. So again, being very objective, maybe seemingly heartless about it, though I don't mean it that way, the spenders in the economy as a percentage of income that flows into those households are the ones who are going to suffer the most as a result of not just the shelter in place, but of course, the economic contraction. So this is going to stick. It's another area, I think, of persistence that you raise, is the distribution of income, and then, of course, The accumulation of savings from that income drives the distribution of wealth, which is an order of magnitude more unequal already. And that will, I think, only grow. And that will compromise economic growth, if only because, as I say, on a very calculated level, the spenders are most compromised. But without perhaps getting too abstract about this, I also think it compromises economic growth because the sort of orientation of the body politic understandably pushes against efforts to exploit cost efficiencies, trade, specialization, elaborate supply chains. The kinds of forces that in the long run increase our potential GDP are precisely the forces that folks may resist, particularly if they are so damaged from this crisis. So I don't think our relationship with one another as a democracy and talking about issues of household welfare and so on is really, none of that is made any easier if a large segment of these households are noticeably jeopardized as a result of this economic crisis. These folks understandably are going to worry much more about their short-run circumstances, as I would as well. And likely, as we've seen the last 7 or 8 years, again, being strictly apolitical about this, resist the sorts of efforts that may ultimately raise gross domestic product, growth, consumption, and indeed the incomes of those individuals, but not if they're left behind. And that's perhaps the most serious, I think, consequence of this sort of disparity that frames your question. I think we need to really worry about that and make sure that we don't cast aside 20 or 30 million individuals in the labor force and their extended households in ways that change the conversation going forward so that it may not be as, if you will, pro-growth and pro-advancement, if you will, as it might otherwise be.
One more question. We only have a couple minutes, but I really feel like it's important that we hear your thoughts on this, just due to your background and your profession. You're an economist, and I'm sure you have best case, base case, worst case scenarios running through your head. You see the economic activity, the impact of the economic activity, how it's going to change behaviors over time. People will become more frugal. The government's going to have to adapt to prepare for a new world. What is your advice to those listeners out there as they begin to prepare for this new normal, when you're taking into account sort of that base case scenario that you're playing out in your head right now?
Yeah, that's a really deep question, and I'll do my best.
Sorry, with only 2 minutes to go.
With only a few minutes. I think you're right. Again, I agree with the premise of your questions. There will be a new normal, and then by definition, right, it'll be different than the current normal or the normal we had a few weeks ago. And I think it's prudent for all firms to consider how they must operate in that environment going forward. And again, there are sort of fallacies of composition here. I think for the individual firms, they have to think of how to operate most productively. And in some cases, that may mean we say all sort of altering the global supply chain, but it may also mean automating in some ways, which of course is the greatest threat to the labor force. So there are tensions. If everyone does that, then the labor force more generally may be compromised in the short run. But nevertheless, I think those sorts of concerns have to be front of mind. How do I operate going forward so that not just my just-in-time inventory procurement process is in some ways immune, forgive the term, to this virus, but so too is my reliance on labor or whatever. And that doesn't mean firing everybody, but it may mean creating a production space or a workspace or a service environment that can accommodate these sorts of threats going forward. I think that's a real problem. The other thing I think firms within industries have to think about is the possibility of concentration. And that is to say, I suspect what will come out of this in a lot of industries will be more market concentration for firms rather than less. And forgive me, but I think community banking is another place where this threat always looms. And I think it looms here as well. Industry concentration, again, if you're the concentrator, is one thing, but most of the firms will not be, and most of the folks in our audience are not. You may want to think about how market share in your industry may change going forward, because some firms may, frankly, gobble up others as a result of adjusting to the new normal. So I think there are sort of, production processes at the very tactical level that a firm, of course, must think about, and I haven't a clue as to what an answer is for this particular firm. But then there's this broader issue, as I say, of concentration or imperfect competition that I suspect we may see more of, certainly in banking, but energy production, perhaps in agriculture, perhaps in processing, whatever the case may be, because of how firms will have to adapt to this new environment. And that could affect the firms who are not part of that concentration effort.
Joe, we're at our time. I could go on and on with you listening to your thoughts on these questions, and I'm going to be selfish and probably call you this week and get some more answers to questions that I have. But again, I want to thank you for taking some precious time of yours to join myself and the rest of the Rotarians in the city and state to hear your thoughts on these very tough questions that everybody is thinking about right now. So thank you.
Thank you, Jason, and thanks to everyone in the audience. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today.
Thank you.